The call, when it finally came, ripped through Captain Tom Maxwell's meticulously ordered, relentlessly scheduled Tuesday afternoon like a stray, unannounced artillery shell. He was at his expansive government-issued desk at the Regional Veterans Affairs Police Headquarters, a sterile, functional space that nonetheless hummed with quiet purpose, deeply engrossed in reviewing a complex, multi-state benefits fraud case that had been consuming his waking hours for weeks. The rhythmic, almost soothing hum of centralized air conditioning and the distant, muted clatter of keyboards from the outer offices formed the familiar, predictable backdrop to his demanding role as chief of this specialized federal law enforcement agency. His father's name, a name synonymous with strength and an almost legendary stubbornness, Sergeant Major Frank Maxwell, USMC, retired, flashed insistently on the secure display of his desk phone, and Tom's gut, an organ he'd learned to trust implicitly over 20 years in law enforcement, clenched with a sudden, inexplicable prescience. Frank, a man of disciplined routine and fierce self-reliance, rarely called him during official work hours, unless it was important a pre-arranged check-in, or unless something was terribly irrevocably wrong. "Dad, you okay? What's up?" Tom managed to keep his voice even professionally calm, the ingrained habit of a man who dealt daily with crises big and small, though a cold tendril of unease was already coiling around his heart. The voice that answered on the other end of the line, however, was not his father's usual robust, gravelly baritone, a voice honed by decades of military command and countless drill fields. It was thin, shockingly reedy, laced with a raw, ragged despair that physically chilled Tom to the bone, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. "Tommy, son, you need to come. Now. Pleasant Valley. My legs." A choked, rasping sob, a sound so alien coming from his stoic father that it felt like a physical blow. That damn woman, she finally did it, Tom. She really did it this time." "Dad, slow down, try to breathe. Who did what? Are you hurt? Are you safe right now?" Panic, cold and sharp as a bayonet, began to prick relentlessly at Tom's carefully constructed composure. Pleasant Valley Homes was the usually tranquil, almost unnervingly well-maintained HOA community where Frank, a highly decorated Vietnam veteran and a double amputee below both knees from a landmine explosion decades ago, had lived with proud independence for the past 10 challenging but fulfilling years. "My prosthetics, son," Frank whispered, his voice cracking each word, laden with an almost unbearable weight of anguish. "They're gone, smashed, destroyed. That woman, that vile woman, Harding, Mrs. Lydia Harding." The self-appointed iron-fisted empress of the Pleasant Valley Homes Homeowners Association, a woman whose obsession with superficial sterile order and an absolute unyielding, almost tomb-like quiet had become legendary within the community, and whose thinly veiled, increasingly venomous animosity towards his father, particularly his father's very existence as a visibly disabled man, had been escalating with alarming frequency for months. "I'm on my way right now, Dad. Don't touch anything, don't go outside. Lock your door. I'll be there in 20 minutes, maybe less." Tom was already shrugging into his official VA police jacket, his mind a chaotic blur, the complex benefits fraud case moments before, so consuming now completely forgotten, relegated to insignificance. His father, a man who had faced down enemy fire with unshakable courage, a man who had endured unimaginable pain and loss without ever truly breaking, sounded utterly devastatingly broken. The thought was an unbearable crushing weight upon Tom's chest. The drive to Pleasant Valley, usually a mundane 25-minute commute through suburban sprawl, was a blur of weaving traffic, flashing hazard lights, and a rising tide of impotent, furious anger. Frank Maxwell was not just his father. He was a living testament to resilience, a hero in the truest sense of the word, a man who had sacrificed his limbs, nearly his life, for his country, in a war that had offered few heroes welcomes. His fierce independence, his ability to navigate the world on his own terms, was largely almost entirely afforded by his state-of-the-art VA-provided prosthetic legs. To attack that independence, to deliberately, maliciously target his father's only means of mobility, was an act of such profound, unimaginable cruelty that it beggared belief. He found his father, when he finally arrived at the small, neat duplex Frank called home, sitting heavily in his old worn leather armchair in the dim living room, His shoulders, usually so straight and proud, now slumped in utter dejection, his face ashen, etched with lines of shock, and a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. The familiar custom-molded prosthetic limbs, marvels of carbon fiber and titanium, usually standing neatly and expectantly in the corner by the front door, or, more often than not, securely and skillfully attached to Frank, enabling his surprisingly agile, remarkably proud upright gait, were nowhere in sight. Instead, on the small, neatly swept concrete front porch, just outside the closed screen door, lay a scene of sickening, deliberate, almost gleeful vandalism. The prosthetics were not merely broken, they had been utterly systematically violated. The gleaming titanium pylons and lightweight, intricately laminated carbon fiber sockets, miracles of modern biomechanical engineering that literally gave his father the freedom to stand, to walk, to live, were now twisted into grotesque, unrecognizable caricatures of their former function. The intricate, expensive hydraulic ankle and knee joints were smashed beyond repair, bent at impossible, horrifying angles, leaking vital fluids. The custom-molded gel liners, painstakingly designed over weeks to fit Frank's specific sensitive residual limbs for maximum comfort and stability, were slashed, torn, and gaping like open bleeding wounds. It was a scene of brutal, targeted, almost surgical destruction, clearly executed with considerable focused force and a chilling, undeniable, malicious intent. A heavy-duty, long-handled gardening shear, one Tom instantly recognized as belonging to the HOA's communally shared tool shed, lay discarded a few feet away on the grass, its wickedly sharp blades stained with something that looked like synthetic hydraulic fluid from the prosthetic knees, and perhaps, Tom thought, with a fresh wave of nausea, with tiny flecks of the composite material from the sockets. "Oh my God, Dad." Tom breathed his professional composure, his years of training to remain detached in the face of trauma momentarily deserting him as he surveyed the appalling wreckage. He knelt slowly, carefully beside his father, who was staring blankly, almost unseeingly, at the destroyed limbs through the mesh of the screen door. His eyes, usually so full of life humor and an old soldier's wisdom, now hollow-haunted, filled with a deep, weary, unspeakable pain. That Mrs. Harding, she was here earlier this morning. Frank said, his voice barely a hoarse whisper, each word an effort. Came right up to the porch, ranting again, about the noise, my infernal noise, she called it. He gestured vaguely, helplessly towards the metallic remnants of his legs. The clack, clack, clacking, she always calls it. Said it disturbed her peaceful enjoyment of her damn prize-winning roses. Said it was unseemly and undignified for a man my age, a man in my condition, to be stomping around like that, drawing attention to himself. His hand, gnarled from age and old half-forgotten war injuries, clenched slowly, painfully, into a white-knuckled fist in his lap. I told her, Tom, like I always do, that these legs are my life, my freedom, my dignity. I told her I earned them. I told her to go to hell and mind her own damn business for a change. She just smiled at me. That awful, tight little, unforgiving smile of hers. And then she said, her voice all sweet and poisonous, "Well, Sergeant Major, perhaps we can find a much quieter, more permanent solution for everyone involved, can't we?" As if summoned by the very mention of her name, Lydia Harding herself appeared emerging with an almost theatrical slowness from her own meticulously manicured, unnaturally silent yard. Next door, a pair of delicate, silver pruning shears in her gloved hand, her expression one of serene, almost beatific, unruffled calm. She glanced with a studied casualness at the wreckage on Frank's porch. Then her gaze flicked sharp and appraising to Tom, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something cold, calculating and undeniably triumphant in her pale ice-blue eyes. "Oh, good afternoon, Chief Maxwell," she said, her voice dripping with a false, cloying, utterly unconvincing sympathy that made Tom's skin crawl. "Such a terrible shame about your father's unfortunate accident with his equipment. But I must say," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, almost intimate whisper that carried clearly in the still afternoon air, "it is remarkably blessedly quieter around here now, isn't it? One can finally hear the birds sing their sweet songs again without all that jarring mechanical clatter." Tom stared at her, a cold, silent, murderous rage washing over him so potent, so absolute, it made his vision momentarily swim the edges of her smug, composed face, blurring into a red haze. He saw not just an overzealous, power-mad HOA president, but the very embodiment of a cruel, petty, insidious tyranny that specifically deliberately targeted the vulnerable, the different, the inconvenient. But then beneath the boiling rage, his professional mind, the keenly analytical mind of a seasoned federal law enforcement officer, the disciplined mind of the chief of the Veterans Affairs Police, was already clicking sharply into place, observing, assessing, analyzing, meticulously building a case, brick by damning brick. This wasn't just felony vandalism, however egregious. This was a targeted assault, a calculated hate crime, a direct unconscionable attack on a disabled veteran, on his very personhood, on the symbols of his hard-won independence. The setup for this despicable, almost unthinkable act had been brewing, simmering like a toxic stew for over a year, ever since Lydia Harding, a relative newcomer to Pleasant Valley Homes, had seized control of the community's homeowners association with a potent, insidious combination of aggressive, well-funded politicking, clever fear-mongering about declining property values and neighborhood safety, and seductive but ultimately hollow promises to restore decorum, discipline, and traditional values to their aging, increasingly diverse community. Her reign, once consolidated, had quickly devolved into one of increasingly arbitrary, inconsistently enforced rules, intrusive, unwarranted inspections of private property, and a chilling, pervasive intolerance for anything or anyone that didn't fit her narrow, suffocating, almost pathologically rigid definition of perfection and appropriateness. We found them Frank Maxwell, with his visible disabilities, his quiet but unshakable dignity, his occasional weekend gatherings of fellow veterans, their shared laughter, their sometimes boisterous camaraderie, their reminiscences apparently also disruptive to the prevailing atmosphere of tranquility, and his steadfast, though always respectful refusal to be intimidated or marginalized had become a particular, almost obsessive focus of her escalating ire. She'd complained formally and repeatedly in writing about the unsightly and non-compliant nature of the small, unobtrusive, VA-approved aluminum access ramp he'd had professionally installed at his front door to accommodate his occasional need for a wheelchair on particularly bad pain days. She'd issued official HOA warnings, citing obscure, newly invented bylaws about the inappropriate and provocative display of the American flag and his cherished Marine Corps guidon outside of narrowly designated federal holidays. She'd even incredibly attempted to implement a new HOA rule strictly limiting the number of non-resident visitors a homeowner could have at any one time, a transparently targeted move clearly aimed at disrupting Frank's veteran support group meetings, which he occasionally hosted. But her most persistent, most venomous, most frequently voiced complaints had always inevitably centered on the perceived sound of his prosthetic limbs. The rhythmic, solid, reassuring click of his artificial feet on the concrete pavement as he took his determined daily walks through the neighborhood, the subtle, almost inaudible whir and click of the sophisticated hydraulic knee joints as he navigated stairs or uneven ground, sounds that to Frank and to Tom represented mobility, life, freedom, and the triumph of the human spirit over adversity, were to the exquisitely sensitive, perpetually aggrieved ears of Lydia Harding an intolerable nerve, shredding clatter, a hideous mechanical disturbance, an unforgivable affront to her precious self-defined and ruthlessly enforced peace and quiet. The inciting incident, the specific moment that had clearly demonstrably pushed Lydia Harding over some internal, precipitous psychological edge, had occurred at the HOA's contentious quarterly meeting just 2 weeks prior. Harding, in her role as president, had proposed a new, ambiguously worded but clearly targeted bylaw. All residents utilizing assistive mobility devices, whether mechanical or animal-assisted, are henceforth required to ensure said devices are equipped with adequate HOA-approved noise-dampening mechanisms and are not to be utilized in any manner that creates undue or persistent auditory disturbance to fellow residents, particularly during designated quiet hours from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. and on weekends. She had then looked directly pointedly with a small, almost triumphant smirk at Frank, who was seated as always in the front row, a silent but powerful symbol of resilience for many in the room. Frank, with his customary quiet dignity and an almost regal bearing, had stood, a slow, deliberate, necessarily methodical process with his prosthetics and addressed the assembled residents. Mrs. Harding, members of the board, fellow residents, he'd said, his voice firm and clear despite his age and the underlying tremor of indignation. These legs, he gestured to his own limbs, are not a luxury, nor are they a mere convenience. They are a medical necessity provided to me at considerable expense by a grateful nation for sacrifices I made in its service many years ago. They allow me to live my life with a measure of independence and dignity that I would not otherwise have. The sound they make, Mrs. Harding, is the sound of my freedom, the sound of my continued ability to participate in this community. And I will not apologize for it, nor will I be made to feel ashamed of it, nor will I allow you or anyone else to legislate it into silence. A smattering of spontaneous, heartfelt applause had followed from some of the more reasonable, compassionate residents in the room. Lydia Harding's face had flushed a dangerous, mottled, almost apoplectic red, her lips tightening into a bloodless, razor-thin line. "Your predictable defiance, Sergeant Major," she'd replied, her voice dangerously soft, each word dripping with controlled venom, "is duly noted, as I assure you will be the inevitable consequences of such public insubordination." Now, looking at the mangled, brutalized remains of his father's hard-won freedom lying like casualties of war on the porch, Tom knew they were seeing those consequences delivered with a chilling personal ferocity. He took a deep, steadying breath, consciously pushing down the surging wave of filial rage and grief, letting the cool, familiar precision of his professional training, his investigator's mindset, take over. "Dad," he said gently, his voice now calm and reassuring, "I need you to stay inside. Don't say anything more to Mrs. Harding, not a word. I'm calling local PD right now to file an initial report for felony vandalism, destruction of medical property, and aggravated assault. Then, Dad, I'm calling my office. This isn't just some petty HOA dispute anymore. This is a federal matter now." See, he turned then and looked Lydia Harding straight in her cold, unblinking eyes, his own gaze now as hard and unyielding as tempered steel. "Mrs. Harding," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority, "I strongly, strongly advise you not to leave your property or attempt to dispose of any potential evidence. The police, both local and federal, will want to speak with you at length, very soon." Her manufactured saccharine smile faltered for a split second, just a momentary crack in the icy facade, revealing a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a nascent dawning of fear in her pale blue eyes, before the mask of serene, untouchable condescension snapped firmly back into place. "Of course, Chief Maxwell," she said smoothly, her voice once again dripping with that false, cloying sympathy that set Tom's teeth on edge. "I have absolutely nothing to hide. I am as shocked and profoundly saddened by this unfortunate incident of vandalism as anyone in this peaceful community. I will naturally cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation." She then turned with a final lingering, almost possessive glance at the destroyed prosthetics and glided with an unnerving swan-like grace back into her perfect, silent, rose-bordered house. The rising action. The inexorable march towards a justice Tom was now fiercely determined to secure began with the prompt arrival of 2 patrol officers from the local police department. Their initial expressions, Tom noted with a grim professionalism, shifted visibly from an anticipated routine HOA squabble to one of serious concerned attention as they surveyed the extent of the damage to the prosthetics and listened with growing gravity to Frank's quiet, dignified, and utterly credible account of Harding's escalating harassment and her thinly veiled threats. Tom, while maintaining a careful, appropriate professional distance to avoid any appearance of undue influence or interference in the local investigation, also formally initiated a high-priority interest file with the Veterans Affairs Police National Operations Center, citing the victim's status as a severely disabled combat veteran and the clear, undeniable evidence of a targeted malicious attack on expensive custom-fitted VA-issued and essential medical equipment, an act which could, and he intended to argue would fall under several federal statutes, including destruction of government property and hate crime provisions. The prosthetics, he knew with a chilling certainty, were not just objects of high monetary value. They were an integral, irreplaceable part of his father's physical and psychological well-being, their brutal destruction a profound symbolic and deeply personal assault. Frank was, as Tom had feared and anticipated, effectively immobilized and deeply dangerously demoralized. The vibrant spark that usually danced in his father's eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dull, vacant look of shock and utter desolation. The Department of Veterans Affairs, however, once alerted by Tom through official channels, responded with commendable speed and compassion. A VA clinical support team, including a highly skilled prosthetist, a specialized rehabilitation therapist, and a compassionate social worker, was dispatched to Frank's home within hours. Arrangements were immediately made for a temporary high-quality wheelchair and any necessary in-home nursing assistance, and the complex, often lengthy and frustrating bureaucratic process of being measured, cast, and fitted for new state-of-the-art custom-made prosthetic limbs was set in motion with an emergency priority status thanks in no small part to Tom's discreet but firm intervention with the regional VA director. But the emotional damage, the deep invisible wounds inflicted by such a cruel and personal attack, Tom knew would take much longer, perhaps a lifetime, to truly heal. His father's fierce, hard-won independence had been stolen in an instant, his dignity deliberately brutally assaulted. Lydia Harding, when questioned later that day by two seasoned local police detectives in the forced intimacy of her own impeccably decorated, ostentatiously formal living room, was a slippery, infuriating, almost theatrical enigma of cooperative denial and feigned victimhood. She knew nothing, she claimed repeatedly, her voice modulated to convey just the right degree of shocked matronly concern about how Sergeant Major Maxwell's prosthetics had been damaged. She expressed profound, if rather histrionically, delivered sympathy for his terrible, unfortunate loss. Perhaps she mused artfully, her brow furrowed in mock concentration. It was some of those unruly, disrespectful teenagers from the less affluent neighboring development, always causing mischief and mayhem in Pleasant Valley. Or maybe she hinted delicately, her eyes wide with feigned innocence, the prosthetics themselves had been old and faulty, and had simply collapsed under their own weight on the porch. She even had the unmitigated gall, the sheer breathtaking audacity, to suggest that Frank, in his understandable distress, and perhaps some unfortunate age-related memory confusion, might be misremembering their earlier conversation that morning, or even perhaps, she whispered with a look of deep sorrowful concern, that he had somehow damaged them himself in a moment of frustration or despair. Dull. She provided a vague, easily disprovable alibi for the presumed time of the incident, claiming to have been indisposed with a sudden debilitating migraine in her darkened, silent bedroom, a claim her own smart home security system records would later contradict. There were, unfortunately, no direct eyewitnesses to the actual act of destruction itself, and no security cameras on Frank's small, unassuming porch, a fact Harding was undoubtedly well aware of. Tom, however, was not remotely deterred by her practiced performance or the initial lack of direct evidence. He knew Harding was lying. He could practically smell the deceit on her, a cloying, artificial scent like cheap perfume trying to mask something rotten. The precision and undeniable brutality of the damage, the clear, methodical use of the HOA's distinctive, heavy-duty shears, which had since disappeared from the communal tool shed, a fact Harding claimed was further evidence of outside troublemakers, her chillingly timed, almost gleeful comment about the newfound quiet. It all pointed directly, unequivocally to her. Drawing on his extensive 20-plus years of experience as a federal law enforcement officer, and specifically as the chief of a VA police force dedicated to protecting veterans from crime, fraud, and abuse, he began his own parallel, meticulous, and officially sanctioned review of Lydia Harding's entire history within the Pleasant Valley Homes HOA. He formally requested, through both local PD channels and VA legal authority, where applicable, access to all past HOA complaints, both those filed by and against Harding, minutes of all board and general meetings, financial records, and any existing records of disputes or altercations involving Mrs. Harding, particularly those concerning elderly, disabled, or veteran residents. He knew from bitter professional experience that bullies, predators, and perpetrators of hate-motivated crimes often followed a discernible escalating pattern of behavior. He was determined to find that pattern. The second shocking event in this escalating, deeply personal nightmare was Lydia Harding's immediate, vicious, and surprisingly well-orchestrated counterattack, a brazen campaign of harassment and misinformation, clearly designed to silence Frank permanently and utterly discredit Tom before his investigation could gain any serious traction. Within days of the initial police report, Frank began receiving a relentless barrage of petty, anonymous, but clearly officially sanctioned HOA violation notices delivered by certified mail. His small, impeccably displayed American flag on its modest porch pole was suddenly non-compliant with newly clarified pole height and material regulations. The unobtrusive VA-installed aluminum accessibility ramp leading to his front door was now deemed an unapproved, aesthetically disruptive structural modification. Even the faint occasional scent of his cherished doctor-permitted evening cigar enjoyed on his secluded back patio was suddenly cataloged as an offensive olfactory nuisance and a violation of communal air quality standards. Simultaneously, Harding, with the help of her closest allies on the HOA board, a small, equally intolerant clique who seemed to either genuinely share her prejudices or were simply too terrified of her to dissent, started an insidious, poisonous whisper campaign amongst the more suggestible, fearful, or simply gossipy residents of Pleasant Valley. They insinuated with carefully chosen damaging words that Frank Maxwell was becoming increasingly mentally unstable, prone to unpredictable, possibly violent outbursts, and had almost certainly broken the prosthetics himself in a fit of senile rage or profound depression. Or perhaps they hinted darkly as a desperate, manipulative ploy to garner sympathy and extort newer, more expensive ones from the long-suffering Veterans Administration. She even had the unmitigated audacity to formally suggest to a few key hand-picked HOA board members, her loyal sycophants, that perhaps Sergeant Major Frank Maxwell was no longer a suitable or safe resident for the tranquil and vulnerable community of Pleasant Valley, and that compassionate, humane options for his supportive relocation to a more appropriate care facility should be explored for his own good, of course. She was attempting to systematically isolate him, to gaslight him, to drive him out of his own home, to effectively erase him from the community she was so determined to mold in her own sterile, intolerant image. Furthermore, a usually friendly, chatty neighbor of Frank's, a quiet, elderly widow named Mrs. Eleanor Gable, who Tom strongly suspected might have seen or heard something significant on the morning of the brutal attack on his father's prosthetics, suddenly became inexplicably evasive, pale and terrified, refusing to speak to him or to the police detectives when they attempted a follow-up interview. She would only mutter fearfully about not wanting any trouble with the HOA, and Mrs. Harding having a very long memory and even longer reach in this community. The implication was chillingly clear. Lydia Harding was actively, aggressively intimidating potential witnesses, using her power and influence to obstruct justice and silence dissent. The midpoint twist. The critical, game-changing breakthrough that began to systematically unravel Lydia Harding's carefully constructed, outwardly respectable facade of civic virtue and expose the festering malignancy beneath came from an unexpected, almost serendipitous discovery deep within the VA's own labyrinthine, often frustratingly opaque bureaucracy, a discovery that, when cross-referenced with Tom's relentless, methodical digging into publicly available records and sealed court documents from other jurisdictions, painted a truly horrifying picture. A diligent, sharp-eyed VA benefits fraud investigator painstakingly reviewing Frank Maxwell's extensive case file in meticulous preparation for the complex process of authorizing and funding the complete replacement of his destroyed prosthetic limbs, stumbled upon a series of almost overlooked, heavily redacted, red-flagged historical claims and legal actions connected to a one Lydia May Harding, her maiden name subtly different, her date of birth, an exact match from a different state, a different lifetime almost 3 decades prior. The disturbing details contained within those old dusty files were chillingly, sickeningly familiar. Credible allegations of severe elder abuse, systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable, severely disabled close relative, and a clear, demonstrable pattern of isolating the victim by systematically cruelly turning neighbors' friends and even other family members against them with lies and manipulations. That unfortunate relative, it turned out, after further more intensive investigation by Tom's VA police analysts, was Lydia Harding's own older brother, Sergeant Thomas Harding, a decorated and severely disabled combat veteran who had returned from the Korean War with catastrophic, life-altering injuries and profound, untreated PTSD. Instead of receiving the compassionate care and unwavering support he so desperately needed and deserved from his only surviving close family member, his younger sister Lydia, he had been systematically, ruthlessly stripped of his military pension his disability benefits his modest home, and ultimately, under highly questionable, legally dubious circumstances, orchestrated by Lydia and a complicit, unscrupulous lawyer, had been declared mentally incompetent by a pliant local court and summarily confined to a bleak, underfunded state institution where he had died alone, forgotten, and penniless just a few years later. Lydia Harding, it appeared, from the subsequent probate records Tom's team unearthed, had inherited everything he once possessed. This shocking, deeply disturbing discovery painted a horrifying, almost gothic psychological portrait of Frank Maxwell's current tormentor. Her pathological obsession with order and quiet, her venomous animosity towards his father, wasn't just about petty HOA power trips, aesthetic sensibilities, or a simple dislike of noise. It was evidently rooted in something far darker, far more deeply ingrained, far more pathologically twisted, a profound, festering, perhaps even sociopathic, lifelong resentment and visceral hatred of disabled veterans. Individuals she perhaps unconsciously or consciously viewed as contemptible burdens, grotesque symbols of weakness, failure, and dependency, an intolerable offensive reminder of a dark chapter in her own family history. She had ruthlessly, profitably, and she thought, permanently erased. Frank Maxwell, with his visible disabilities, his quiet resilience, his innate dignity, his refusal to be cowed or marginalized, was an intolerable daily affront to her carefully constructed, warped worldview. A ghost from her past, she was now determined to exercise with the same ruthless efficiency she had employed decades before. Tom also had his VA Police Cybercrimes Unit working in full cooperation with the local police department and armed with entirely legal, judicially approved warrants obtained on the basis of the mounting circumstantial evidence and Harding's increasingly suspicious behavior conduct a deep forensic dive into her extensive online activities. They uncovered her active, enthusiastic participation in several obscure, virulently anti-veteran, anti-disability online forums and hate groups, platforms where she posted under anonymous pseudonyms, spewing vitriol against coddled parasitic veterans, malingering cripples, and the societal drain of the unproductive disabled. More chillingly and directly relevant to the current case, they found a series of recent specific and highly incriminating search queries on her home computer and personal tablet: how to permanently disable advanced prosthetic limbs, force required to break titanium prosthetic struts, legal consequences for damaging essential medical equipment, best tools for cutting carbon fiber composites. The monster was not just at the gate, Tom realized with a fresh wave of cold fury. She was meticulously, calmly, almost scientifically researching her preferred weaponry. The climax. The inevitable explosive confrontation was set for an emergency, specially convened HOA meeting. The meeting had been ironically and much to Harding's visible fury called not by her or her board allies, but by a large, newly emboldened group of Pleasant Valley residents who, horrified by the blatant, brutal attack on Frank Maxwell and disgusted by Harding's subsequent campaign of victim-blaming and intimidation, were now vociferously demanding her immediate resignation, or failing, that her formal removal from the HOA presidency through a vote of no confidence. Lydia Harding, ever arrogant, ever supremely convinced of her own untouchable invincibility, and the stupidity of her opposition, had reluctantly agreed to the meeting, clearly planning to use it as a public platform to ferociously denounce her persecutors, rally her remaining loyalists with VD more fear-mongering, and portray herself as the innocent, long-suffering victim of a vicious, politically motivated smear campaign orchestrated by a vengeful, power-abusing Tom Maxwell and his clearly unstable, attention-seeking father. She stood imperiously at the clubhouse podium, a picture of martyred wrong composure, delivering a rambling, increasingly unhinged, self-pitying diatribe, filled with thinly veiled threats against her accusers and grandiose, delusional pronouncements about her own selfless dedication to Pleasant Valley. Frank Maxwell was present, seated in his temporary VA-loaned wheelchair in the front row, his expression one of weary, profound sorrow, but his eyes, when they occasionally met Tom's across the crowded, tension-filled room, held an unshakable old soldier's resolve. His presence alone, his quiet dignity, in the face of such ugliness, was a more powerful indictment of Harding than any words could be. When Lydia Harding finally, reluctantly, and with ill-concealed contempt, yielded the floor, Tom Maxwell stepped forward. He was there ostensibly as Frank Maxwell's son, a concerned Pleasant Valley resident with a personal stake in the proceedings. But his very presence, his calm, measured, authoritative demeanor, the almost palpable aura of quiet power he exuded, resonated with the unspoken but undeniable weight of his official position as the chief of a federal law enforcement agency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply, methodically, devastatingly, and with chilling precision, laid out the undeniable, meticulously documented facts. He spoke first with quiet pride and deep emotion of his father's distinguished military service, his sacrifice for his country, his long, arduous journey of recovery and adaptation. He then detailed, with stark, unsparing clarity, the calculated, brutal destruction of his father's prosthetic limbs. Limbs he described not as mere objects, but as essential medical devices, as extensions of his father's very being, as keys to his hard-won independence and dignity, devices provided and maintained at significant taxpayer expense by the Veterans Administration. He then, with cold, forensic precision, presented the newly uncovered damning evidence of Lydia Harding's dark, hidden family history, her documented pattern of predatory abusive behavior towards a severely disabled veteran in her own family, her chilling specific online research into methods of destroying prosthetic limbs, and the crucial forensic evidence connecting her directly to the crime scene, minute, almost invisible traces of specific, rare chemical compounds found in her prize-winning organically grown rose fertilizer that had also been found under microscopic analysis embedded deep within the damaged hydraulic joints of Frank's prosthetics, and a partial distinctive, almost unique shoe print found preserved in a patch of damp earth on Frank's porch, directly beside the discarded gardening shears that precisely matched a limited edition expensive brand of imported Italian gardening clogs Harding was known to favor and frequently wore. As Tom spoke, his voice never rising above a calm conversational level, but each word landing with the impact of a hammer, blow a stunned, absolute hush fell over the crowded room, broken only by Lydia Harding's increasingly agitated, incoherent muttering and the occasional horrified gasp from the assembled residents. Then, just as Tom concluded his presentation of the forensic evidence, Mrs. Eleanor Gable, Frank's timid, elderly neighbor, the one who had previously been too terrified to speak, suddenly shockingly stood up from her seat in the back row, her small, frail body trembling visibly, but her voice, when she finally found it, surprisingly clear and strong. I saw her. She stammered, her gaze fixed not on Harding, but on Frank Maxwell, as if drawing strength from his quiet presence. She then turned and pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at a now visibly sweating Lydia Harding. That morning, the morning of the incident, I saw Mrs. Harding on Sergeant Major Maxwell's porch. It was very early. She had those big, shiny cutters from the community shed. I was scared to say anything before. She came to my house later that day after the police left. She told me it would be much better for everyone, especially for me, if I just forgot what I thought I saw. Cornered, exposed, her carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation, crumbling around her under the undeniable weight of irrefutable evidence and damning, courageous eyewitness testimony, Lydia Harding finally, spectacularly, irrevocably snapped. Her face, moments before a mask of feigned indignation, contorted into a terrifying visage of pure, unadulterated, almost primal hate. Yes, damn you all, I did it. She shrieked, her voice cracking, ascending into a near hysterical, venomous fury that stunned the room into absolute horrified silence. And I'd do it again 1,000 times. Those noisy, clanking, hideous, unnatural things, he deserved it, all of you. You coddled, ungrateful, parasitic veterans. You burdens on decent society with your endless selfish demands, your constant, ugly reminders of failure and brokenness. This was a peaceful, respectable, orderly community before he and his disruptive kind brought their inherent brokenness, their ugliness here. He needed to be silenced. They all do. They all need to be put out of their and our misery. Her hate-filled rambling, shockingly vitriolic tirade, a grotesque, unexpected geyser of long-suppressed poisonous venom and twisted ideology, echoed through the stunned, horrified, utterly silent clubhouse. In that precise, defining moment, as Harding paused for breath, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a mad light, Tom Maxwell stepped forward again, his movement swift, decisive, authoritative. Lydia Harding, He stated, his voice now resonating with the full, cold, unwavering authority of his federal office. "Your words witnessed by this entire assembly constitute a clear and unambiguous admission of guilt, and furthermore, provide undeniable evidence of a hate-motivated crime committed against a disabled United States veteran. Given the victim's legally protected status, the specific nature of this violent assault involving VA-related and VA-funded property, and the overwhelming evidence of bias, premeditation, and extreme malice, as Chief of the Veterans Affairs Police, under the authority granted by Title 38, United States Code, Section 902, and acting in full concert with local law enforcement authorities present here today, I am placing you under arrest for felony destruction of property, aggravated assault, and multiple violations of federal hate crime statutes." As he spoke, two of his own plainclothes, VA police officers who had been discreetly strategically present in the audience throughout the tumultuous meeting, along with several uniformed local PD officers, moved swiftly, silently, and professionally to handcuff a now screaming, struggling, utterly unhinged Lydia Harding, her reign of petty tyranny and hidden malevolence brought to a sudden, dramatic, and very public end. The falling action following Harding's shocking arrest in front of the entire horrified community was swift, decisive, and widely publicized. Lydia Harding's immediate and strenuous efforts to secure bail were summarily denied by a federal magistrate who, after reviewing the evidence presented at the preliminary hearing, including the multiple recordings of her hate-filled confession at the HOA meeting, deemed her an extreme flight risk and a clear, undeniable danger to the community, particularly to its veteran and disabled populations. The local district attorney's office, working in close, seamless conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, due to the significant federal hate crime charges and the involvement of VA property, built an utterly ironclad, multi-layered case against her. Her own venomous, self-incriminating outburst at the HOA meeting, captured on dozens of smartphones and officially recorded by the HOA secretary, became a cornerstone of the prosecution's evidence, a damning testament to her profound malice and deeply ingrained prejudice. She was, the prosecution would later argue, a predator who hid her sociopathic tendencies behind a veneer of civic responsibility and HOA regulations. The Pleasant Valley Homes HOA board, shamed by their past inaction, implicated by their tacit support of Harding's reign, and facing a torrent of outrage from residents, resigned en masse within days of her arrest. The community, though deeply sobered and profoundly disturbed by the revelation of such profound, festering malice in their seemingly idyllic midst, began a difficult but necessary process of collective healing, self-reflection, and institutional reform. There was an immediate, overwhelming, and deeply moving outpouring of support for Frank Maxwell. Veterans organizations from across the state and even nationally offered assistance, both financial and moral. Local businesses, churches, and civic groups volunteered materials, funds, and labor to improve the accessibility of his home and to help cover any expenses not immediately met by the VA. The story, picked up by national media outlets, sparked a much-needed, wider public conversation about the often hidden discrimination, abuse, and neglect faced by disabled veterans and the elderly, particularly within the sometimes insular and unregulated world of homeowners associations. The resolution for Frank Maxwell was a testament to his indomitable spirit and the profound resilience forged in the crucible of war and lifelong adversity. He became quite unintentionally a local hero, a reluctant but powerful symbol of courage and survival. With the full, unwavering, and significantly expedited support of the Department of Veterans Affairs, an organization Tom was proud to serve, an organization that, for all its bureaucratic flaws, often rose to the occasion when its charges were so grievously wronged. Frank was fitted with new state-of-the-art prosthetic limbs, even more advanced, more comfortable, and more responsive than his previous destroyed pair. He learned to walk on them with his old, familiar, indomitable pride, though perhaps now with a new, deeper understanding of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human kindness and compassion. He, even with Tom's gentle encouragement and the enthusiastic support of many of his Pleasant Valley neighbors, started a small, informal support and advocacy group within the community for elderly and disabled residents, determined to ensure that no one else would ever again suffer the kind of isolation, intimidation, and targeted harassment that he had endured for so long at the hands of Lydia Harding. He became, in his own quiet, dignified way, a vocal, respected advocate for stronger legal protections against elder abuse, disability, discrimination, and hate crimes targeting veterans. Tom Maxwell, watching his father some months later take his first confident, strong steps on his new legs at a community welcome home and appreciation party held in his honor in the newly reformed Pleasant Valley Clubhouse. A clubhouse now managed by a democratically elected, compassionate, and inclusive resident council, felt a profound, almost overwhelming sense of justice, a justice that was both deeply, intensely personal and broadly satisfyingly professional. The fight had been ugly, the enemy surprisingly, disturbingly venomous, but the outcome was a clear, ringing testament to the enduring strength of family, the unwavering support of a truly caring community, and the steadfast, unwavering commitment of the institutions like his own VA police designed and dedicated to protecting the nation's veterans. The final scene, nearly a year after Lydia Harding's conviction and sentencing to a long, well-deserved prison term, showed Frank Maxwell walking proudly, almost jauntily, down the main tree-lined street of Pleasant Valley homes, the rhythmic, solid, reassuring clack, clack, clack of his new prosthetic limbs, no longer a sound of contention or a trigger for malice, but a sound of defiance, of strength, of a life fully, joyously reclaimed. Children on bicycles waved neighbors out, tending their gardens smiled, and called out cheerful greetings. Lydia Harding was a dark, fading, almost forgotten memory, a cautionary tale whispered among residents. The peace of Pleasant Valley was no longer the fragile, artificially enforced, oppressive silence of intolerance and fear, but the vibrant, messy, inclusive, and genuinely joyful harmony of a community that had faced its own internal demons, confronted its prejudices, and chosen deliberately and decisively to heal, to grow, and to truly honor and embrace all its members, especially those like Sergeant Major Frank Maxwell, who had already given so much in service to their country and their fellow citizens.